Welcome to Space Makers, a fresh new podcast brought to you by Spaces Magazine, the Bay Area-wide publication that showcases audacious architecture, interiors, and landscape design. It's curated by well-known editor, author, and columnist Zahid Sadar, and hosted by Spaces managing editor Daniel Jewett. This podcast goes beyond the glossy printed pages of Spaces to amplify the talents behind the exciting ideas that are changing our local design scene, all in their own voices. Listen up and enjoy.
Designer Charles de Lisle grew up in rural Massachusetts, where his father had a woodworking shop. Always curious, the young man spent his time taking in his father's work and exploring nearby factories while collecting bits of scrap and industrial products he found along the way. His imagination piqued by these experiences, de Lisle studied ceramics and eventually moved to California, where he began welding and making light fixtures. In 2010, he started his own office in San Francisco before moving to the Bayside city of Sausalito, California. The design collective he created now focuses on custom fabricated furniture, lighting, decorative arts, and interior and landscape projects. Work from his office has been featured in Architectural Digest, New York Times T Magazine, The Wall Street Journal, and more. And this year, his firm was named to the AD 100. Be sure to pick up the next issue of Spaces to read about his own reimagined weekend getaway in nearby Sebastopol. Now, let's meet Charles. Hi, Charles, and welcome to Space Makers.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thanks a lot for being here. First, tell me about being named to the AD Top 100. That's quite an honor.
Yeah, it's super exciting. I've been doing interior work for about 20 years. And I think to get that kind of feedback loop from your peers is fantastic. And the people on that list are all amazing. They're all people that I've always looked up to. And it's definitely an exciting thing for us as a company.
Charles, you have cited influences such as architect William Worcester and artist William Turnbull. How did you first come across their work, and what struck you about it?
Kind of growing up in the 70s, I always loved this kind of romantic idea of a barn conversion, which was very cool back then. And I think it's still very cool now. And I think there was this language that was out in the world of this kind of wooden, humble building that was made more sophisticated through design and through a different way of looking at it. And there was something in the Bay Area that I didn't realize until I moved here. And saw there was a show of William Worcester's work at the SF MoMA back, I think it was in 96 or something. And it really was inspirational and an amazing thing to see. I had never seen work like that before. The buildings were really beautifully put together and humble, and they were about something different. And they had this amazing way of thinking about living that I thought was very specific to California. And it was something I really responded to and got excited about. And so my whole career has kind of been based on actually that experience and that idea of that experience of kind of looking at things in that way. But I now use that methodology of thinking in all kinds of projects, whether it's restaurants in Mexico City or apartments in Manhattan, beach houses in Hawaii. Like, we've worked on a lot of different things, but I always think about things in that with that way of process of like, how do you move through a building? What feels graceful? How important is the light? You know, how does the space feel versus how does the space look? And I think those are two different things.
I would guess that how you live in the space, how you move through it, is really important.
Definitely. I think that for me, the first thing that I do when I start working on a project is I start to consider, how do you go through the building and how do you experience it, and what kind of emotional response do you get in each part of that building? And I think that's a really important thing in making a successful project.
Charles, you've said your experience in commercial and hospitality design play a part in informing your residential projects. All that design data and vendor knowledge that you've accumulated must be a big help.
Definitely. I mean, I think with all things, like, the bigger your toolbox, the more successful you are at coming up with solutions. I think the more things that you know about, the more freedom you have to actually have to experiment and maybe think about things a little bit differently because you understand a certain way of moving about things that you're confident doing. I was just explaining that to someone in my office this morning about how I wanted her to get to the point of being a skateboarder with the process, because, I'm not a skateboarder, but, there's certain things that you learn, and like in skateboarding, where you have to practice enough where you don't have to think about how you're moving the board with your feet and how you're using balance, and you process in a different way. It's kind of like surfing and maybe snowboarding. They're all very California things now that I think about it. But, with snowboarding, it's like you have to learn to forget how to use your feet and use the edges of the board to successfully get down the mountain in a fluid way and then take more risks. And I think it's the same with anything else. And especially with what we're doing, it's like, the more practice that you have, the better you become at making cool things. And so all the hospitality work and the commercial work definitely informs how I move through residential projects. But for me, it's all the same thing. I mean, I do landscape projects for clients. I do some branding sometimes. I look at graphics. I look at exteriors of buildings. I still do some commercial work and specify materials for developers. And I like doing all of it. For me, it's all the same thing. It's all kind of using a system to try to make things better. And that's what I like doing.
Charles, moving through a project as if you're on a skateboard sounds kind of fun. Do you guys pull from your databases before starting a project like that? Or do you want it to be more organic?
Well, I think it's more about like honing your skills so you don't have to think about those skills, like, being deft at kind of finding solutions, whether it's looking at color, understanding how egresses work in buildings, how to even facilitate purchasing something. How do you efficiently get through that purchasing process to make sure it's accurate and something shows up and it's awesome, so you can focus on the part that makes it special, right? So you kind of need to know all of those skills really well and kind of have that ability to unconsciously do them while you're focusing on the other piece, which is the creative piece. And so it takes a while. It's it's something you have to train to do.
Your work on the San Francisco home of Jessica and Aaron Siddig took about 5 years to complete. A recent article on the project says it wasn't unusual to spend about 8 hours with the couple discussing a doorknob. What was that process like?
It was a great project. It was one of those probably once in a lifetime projects where everything just felt really great. The clients and I got along really well. We all had a different viewpoint, and the three of us together really allowed those different viewpoints to become realized. And I think that's super rare. I think that I was fortunate that they were really interested in design and design process, and that was part of what they wanted. That house is more about story than it is about image, and that's what I love. I love things that have a narrative or surprise you with a story that's kind of hidden in the interior. It's not so much about what the photograph looks like. It's more about, what do you experience when you're in that space? And it's exactly what they were interested in as well. So those meetings were, they were fun. They were exciting, because we really thought about what were the best solutions for some of these things that we were building in the house, and took our time to do it right. I think, there was a 1960s house, and we wanted to make sure that the house felt like a 1960s house. So part of that, quote was about this search for the right style hinges in the cabinet door. So when you open the door, it feels like a 1960s door. And that's a very different feeling than if you have a new door with Euro hinges on it. That's, just a different mechanical system.
Of course.
And so what was exciting is that they were interested in that feeling. Like they wanted, so when they opened a kitchen cabinet that it felt like you were in a house in the 60s, they didn't want to remodel that out of the project. And that was super exciting and is exactly, I think, what we do in our office. We consider everything. And then we try to pare back those things and edit and figure out, okay, what do we need to focus on to make this work?
Charles, the home does have a lot of mid-century inspired touches, but the powder room, with its hand-carved elm sink and black lacquered panels, seems to be a bit outside that aesthetic. How did that come to be?
I use references from all over the place. I don't have any set of rules that I stick to. And previously, before working on that project, I had been collaborating with Rick Yoshimoto, who is an assistant to J.B. Blunk, who is a sculptor who lived in Inverness, in West Marin in the 70s and 80s, and was a prolific, important Bay Area artist. And Rick worked with him for 30 years doing a lot of the chainsaw work. And JB was known for these very brutal, large, and beautiful chainsaw carved wooden pieces. And when I met Rick, I thought that it would be interesting to develop a line of furniture for fun, to, try to take my language of geometry that I like, that's very simple and complicated, in the way that it's spared down, and then use his method of carving. And I liked the idea of collaborating on something to try to figure out, can we make something that's not recognizable or something new out of that. And so we created this whole series of chainsaw furniture that was these really beautiful carved shapes that were all based on the pieces of wood that we found. And then we kind of edited them out to these very, very simple forms. And then when I met the clients on that project, we started looking at things, and we were looking at things that were inspiring. And one of the things we saw was a sink that J.B. Blunk had made for his house. That was this wooden carved sink that they thought was really beautiful. And so we kind of then, took the next step to say, well, what is a way we could interpret that in the house, and where would that be fun? And there was this story of this bowl that JB had made that was carved out of a single piece of wood that actually was a bowl to hold a baby. It was a little bassinet. It was this beautiful oval shaped bowl. And they were thinking about having kids at the time. Now they have 3 kids. And we thought, well, it would be fantastic to make a sink that could actually double as a place to wash a baby, and that piece of wood could hold a baby. And we thought that again was this like really great story to build on in the house, and thought that doing something monolithic in there would be really fantastic. And so I worked with Rick for over 2.5 years, slowly carving down like 3 massive pieces of wood, and making sure we ended up working on just 2 because we had to make sure we covered the risk of one of them splitting in half, because cut a solid piece of wood that big is actually difficult. You have to work very slowly. And then at the end, to even get it in there was a challenge, to get that,
I'll bet,
1.5 ton block of wood into a little tiny finished bathroom, and then get it fully plumbed was engineering feat in and of itself. So all of that to me is exciting. Like I like all of those different parts and challenges of doing something like that. And at the end, what's amazing is you come across this thing that's like you walk in, it's super familiar, and that's one of my favorite things. You walk in, it doesn't seem bizarre, it looks familiar. And then, but when you get up to it and you start realizing what it is, then you start realizing there's something unique and kind of special about it in another way, of like that it is a solid piece of wood and it's not built out of veneers, and it is this kind of crazy object and piece of art all of a sudden. And I think that's again, like the ideal of what I try to do. I love that process, whether it's on something so labor intensive and complicated as that sink, or sometimes could be something really simple.
Great. You also collaborated with the Future Perfect to create a new lighting collection in an array of finishes. You have said it was inspired by cherry blossoms and bicycles. Can you explain the inspiration and tell us a little bit about the line?
I made the first chandelier in 2004 for a client, and we were looking for something that was graphic and kind of made sense to this house I was working on that was a William Worcester ranch house. And it had been owned by a woman who was fascinated by trees and had a whole arboretum that she had planted around this house where every tree was a different tree. And we thought, well, it'd be nice to try to have some of that story inside. And I don't know how it evolved. It just kind of happened. This idea of having this kind of Japanese branch that wherein the cherry blossoms come on the branches, there's no leaves on the branches. It's just this twig with these blossoms, and kind of started from that and evolved into making this piece out of this hexagonal tubing that I had come across. And it was really complicated to cut and put together. And so we had to find a bicycle maker who understood how to cut those pieces and braze them. So the first one was really labor intensive. And then I had become friends with David, the owner of the Future Perfect. and we met at Salone in Milan during the Italian furniture fair, and I realized we were similar spirits and we're excited about similar things. And when he got back, he looked up my work and saw that piece and asked me if we could start producing it. But the main original piece was in production for about 5 years, and we've just in the last 2 years developed a collection around it. And so that just launched a year ago, and it's super exciting. So we were, the idea was to build kind of a basic set of lighting that could work anywhere. It could fit in a modern or a traditional house, an arts and crafts house, a beach house, apartment. Like it wasn't, didn't have any specific direction, and used the kit of parts that we developed for the main chandelier. So, and it took about 2 or 3 years to develop the pieces, and we're super excited about the first set of 8.
And have you seen those fixtures applied to a wide range of locales at this point?
I've used the sconces in many different locations, and I've seen them installed in different locations. Just recently, they actually opened a new showroom in New York that has a 40-foot long vertical, like a waterfall pendant chandelier that we did that is really amazing. So it's so exciting to see something that goes down like a 5-story staircase, which is exactly what we intended that piece for. So that was exciting. We've done a lot of custom branch fixtures for people, which is great. The cool thing about it is we figured out a way to make the parts modular so we can modify them. So we've done things that are very branch-like and things that are super stripped down and minimal, all to order for customers. And I think that's kind of really what we were trying to do, is make something that can have a kit of parts that could be beautiful, but change dependent on what it needs to do.
Another project of note was creating store interiors for fashion designer Rachel Comey. For that, you worked with architect Elizabeth Roberts for the New York and then later the Los Angeles store. What was that collaboration like?
It was super fun. I mean, Rachel is amazing. She's a good friend now and also a great collaborator. She is always pushing to look at things differently, which I love. Elizabeth is a Marin girl, actually. I believe she's from San Rafael, and she moved to New York and started doing really great projects there. And I collaborated with her on a couple projects, and that's how I got introduced to Rachel. And I think the three of us had a lot of fun working on both of the spaces, the one in LA and the one in New York, kind of trying to look at things again differently. I think the idea was to make a more masculine, like brutal space that would hold beautiful clothes for women and for strong women. And that was challenging. And so again, like it was the right fit for a client in my office, and to try to just like tweak the things that are regular and figure out how to make them a little more special.
So you were going for kind of a contrast.
Yeah, definitely. It was all about like rough surfaces versus soft things, like smooth leather, like really beautiful woven wicker with really rough concrete, polished floors with super soft carpet and like lamb's wool and fur, felt. Like all of these things were mixed together to be really a little jarring almost, which is great. And it's kind of what she does with her clothes as well. I'm a huge fan.
You created a model home for the new tower at 181 Fremont. What did you bring to that project, and why do you think you were selected for it?
Well, I think I was brought on board to kind of maybe look at a different demographic that might be a buyer in a high-rise in downtown San Francisco. I think that my clientele is probably around 30 to 40 years old, and they're more risk takers, and they're people who are aware of design. They are well traveled, so they see, what's going on in New York and in London and Los Angeles, and so they're a different type of buyer than a lot of the buildings are being marketed in San Francisco. And the Mark Company, which had brought me into that project, was aware of kind of my client base and thought that I would be a good counter to the other spaces that were in there. And so what we did is we really looked at that space and tried to figure out like, well, what do apartments in New York look like that, a buyer of this type of unit would be interested in. And so it was actually a super fun project to look at our work and our client base and try to figure out like how it would fit into a different sensibility. And that being said, like we do apartments in high rises for people. And so that's part of what we do. It's not all shacks in Marin. We enjoy all that kinds of work. And I love working on apartments actually in a way because it's a fixed space. You're limited to what's there and you can only remodel it so much. So you have to kind of make it work with what it is. And I think that challenge is really great. So it was a fun project. I think it was a super successful model, and they looked really beautiful when they were done. We got a really great set of feedback from them, and I believe they're still up right now. And I'm not quite sure. I think the building's almost sold out though, so they're probably
really already sold out.
Yeah,
huh?
Which is a good thing. And I think that's the point of the model is to really show people like how they can imagine spaces and how they could imagine different types of spaces.
That project and other high-end projects like it represent a changing San Francisco. How have you seen the city change over the last decade?
A lot. I moved to San Francisco in 1990, and I think between 1990 and 2000, there was a huge shift. And I think between 2000 and now, there was a really big shift.
Mm-hmm.
I think, the early time that I was in the city, the digital world in Silicon Valley hadn't really exploded. It was right when I started doing interiors that started happening, and that was exciting. And I think there was a whole different type of person that was moving into the city versus being in the suburbs where that energy was down near Palo Alto. I think that there was a big shift in the world, and the exciting thing is we're kind of in the space that happened. So I like that. I am a person who likes change. Sometimes the change doesn't always make things perfect. So right now, we're fighting with crazy traffic and issues with real estate costs that are prohibitive. And I think that's frustrating. But on the flip side, it's kind of like what happens when there's growth and there's change. And so I always look on that side of it. So the city's changed a lot. When I moved here, Esprit was still happening. And there was this whole fashion world that was going on here of clothing manufacturing and design and photography. And that brought with it so much other stuff that was in the city that is not here now. But conversely, now we have something different, and it's also exciting. The people that we're working with are changing a lot of things in the world. The way that you take a taxi, the way that you pay for your groceries, all of these things are things that my clients have worked on. And so to me, that's super fascinating. I think it's exciting, and it's definitely different. It's changed the city. There's a lot of the pockets of the city that were kind of sketchy and grungy that I loved that are now gone. I think that's true in most cities right now. So it's not unique to San Francisco. Actually, part of what I love about moving to Sausalito is there's this dynamic happening in Marin that's different, where I think that there's a younger person who is now based in San Francisco at some of these larger companies that was down in Palo Alto before, but now their office is headquartered downtown. So they're looking at Marin as a place to live versus, looking at Woodside or, places in Cupertino. And so I think it's been really cool to see Mill Valley change and get younger and kind of a little bit, more interesting and cooler. And to me, that feels great. And then the part of Sausalito that I love is it isn't changing that rapidly. And it's part of the Bay Area that is still there. It's a little funky, and there's houseboats and a little bit of kookiness going on. And that's one of my favorite things about being here. The great part about San Francisco is that it's still a vibrant city.
Where do you see it headed in the next 10 years?
I don't know. That's a super hard question.
Maybe impossible.
That's an impossible question. There'll probably be self-driving cars, and it'll be a lot easier to get around. That's my hope. Or it'll be worse.
Charles, you like to mix materials, touch on historical themes, chase contradictions, and keep clients surprised. Given that rather large grab bag, how do you start on a new project? How do you know you're going the right way?
I usually have a couple of meetings with a client where I try to figure out our relationship. And I think, for me, every project is different, and our office treats every project differently. And we walk into each one without a set of rules and try to not look at it like we're placing a style or our style stamp on anything. We really try to look at things as individual projects. Within that, we reference things similar from project to project, but we don't have a look that we kind of put on a project. And so to start the project, we usually sit down with a client and actually put out tons of materials, wood samples, images of different types of projects, images of different locations, different materials, metals, fabrics, all different kinds of fabrics, paint swatches. And we kind of create like a big play table. And what we do is we weave through that with the client and ask them questions during that process. We usually do that once or twice. And what that does is it allows us to kind of see who the client is, and see what they like, see what they don't like, see where we might be able to push them into something they don't like, see kind of how they live, ask them questions about, the way that their project is laid out. I think that's how we start. We start every project the same way. It's super organic, and we usually take our time through that process because we want to make sure that the fit's right. And we find most of the people that come to our office are looking for that, so they understand that they want something that's a little bit more fluid and about embracing the space and the way it feels.
When a client asks for something you don't like, where do you draw the line?
I think it all depends. And for me, it's all about context. I mean, there are some things that I don't like that I find are perfect. And then sometimes there are things that I think are perfect that they don't like. And, for me, I can be a little relentless. If I think that there is a solution that is the right solution, I'll fight for it. And sometimes it happens and sometimes it doesn't. But I think that's part of what you hire us for. It's kind of going back to that toolbox experience again. It's like, you're hiring us because we've done this a bunch of times. We've installed a lot of houses. We know what the problems are. We also know where we can push things to make them more interesting. We also know where it might be appropriate to take a risk. And that's because we have that knowledge base and that history and the experience. And so what I find is it's about kind of learning the trust level. And then I'm always trying to stay open. Like sometimes a client will throw something out that I think is not appropriate or horrible or not good at all. And then sometimes, 2 days later, I completely turn around and be like, you know what? I think this could be a cool solution. I think I'm going to look at it and figure out if it can go in a different direction. And I think those are the best projects for me. The ones that are the most challenging are always the ones that come out to be better in the end. You're willing to kind of move through things in a different way. And that's where you come up with that mistake. That mistake is kind of where you have that eureka. Oh my God, like that's the super cool little moment that just happened. And there's no way I could have thought of that on my own, without the client, without the project, without something happening by accident, and without being flexible and organic to kind of move through that and see that there's something special there.
So it's a collaboration, or like you said earlier, it's telling a story or getting to a story.
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, I went to art school and studied making art and kind of realized that I'm, basically still an artist. I just happen to fall into the art that I do is about space. It's not necessarily academic art making. I think the decorative arts are super important. And they're very human. People I think have decorated their houses longer than they've decorated their walls with art. They've, manufactured spaces to live in to make them feel a certain way. And I think that, so for me, that there's a natural kind of progression of working through those things with a client that is about making art. I think that's about being creative. Like, I think, that's what we do well. And that's the medium I work in. I work in other people's houses.
So to that end, what makes a space for you?
I think a successful space is one that, first of all, feels good. Like when you walk in, you can feel a space when it feels good. And I think a lot of when we do renovations, it's figuring out how to make whatever space we have work the best it can. And that's about having air, having blank space, having space for your eyes to rest, having experience to move from one place to the other. And I can tell right away when I go into a project that I think is not a great project or a space because it doesn't feel right. What makes a space for me, I think, really comes down to that idea of how it works, but then also the quality of the things that are in it. And it doesn't mean that things have to be super expensive or fancy, but they have to be right. And sometimes being right means they're the wrong proportion, like they're crazy big scaled chairs in this small room. Or sometimes it's something as simple as the quality of the upholstery for us is a really big deal. And for me, I like building things that last, that are going to be in a house a long time. And so I notice right away the detail work of things as upholstery and lighting, because to me those are the things that stick around. And I notice right away when they're off the shelf or not. And to me, that kind of makes or breaks sometimes a good interior and a not great interior. And again, it doesn't have to be expensive. It just has to be appropriate. It's got to fit. If it doesn't fit, it doesn't work.
Right. And you can feel that instantly.
Yeah, I think everybody can. I think that's, I think the thing that's difficult is everybody, I think, feels whether a space is right or not. It's just they don't know how to take it apart and put it back together again. And that's super challenging and complicated. And I think that's where, when you're hiring a professional, that's what you're doing. You're trying to get help in figuring out all those things that you don't know how to weave through. It's kind of like a life coach, but for carpets and exactly, for kitchen cabinets.
Charles, what design element can you not live without?
We have a lot of great ceramics in our house, and I eat off of all different kinds of things every day. And it could be a coffee mug or plate or a great set of dishes to have dinner on, anything. I mean, it's something I've collected my whole life. And I think because I studied ceramics, I have an affinity towards it. And I think there's something magical about having a bowl or a plate that's your go-to bowl. Every time you go to get ice cream, there's that ice cream bowl that you always put the ice cream in that bowl because it feels like the awesome bowl. And so for me, those things are the objects that are super important to me.
Thank you. And in wrapping up, tell us what's next for you and the firm.
We're super excited about projects we're working on. We're doing really big projects. We're doing small ones. I'm starting to work on a new restaurant in Mexico City, which is very exciting. It's a bigger restaurant from the restaurant I did 7 years ago. We're going to basically be putting in a new kitchen, a bigger kitchen that could be more creative for the chef, in a really cool space. I love working in Mexico City. I'm going to be designing all the furniture out in the Yucatan at a little factory that we've found. That's super exciting. I love going on those kind of journeys and trips to find great stuff. I don't know. I think we're excited about what we're doing. We're doing really great upholstery right now and beautiful custom furniture. I'm still making more lighting that's yet to be seen if it's going to be a collection or not.
Charles, thanks so much for being here today, and thanks for being our first Space Makers guest.
Oh, it's exciting. It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me. Super appreciate being invited.
Thanks, Charles.
Thanks.
Thank you for listening to Space Makers. You can find us online at marinmagazine.com/spaces and on social media at Facebook and Instagram. Or email us your comments at letters@spacesmag.com.